On January 1st, 1959, the US-backed government in Cuba fell. A brutal revolution that had raged on for 5 years had finally forced the Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista, out of power, ushering in Fidel Castro's new regime. Early intelligence reports show how his actions on the island gradually turned America against him. Under his leadership, the Cuban state began to resemble a direct contradiction to American ideology. The country spat in the face of the US's free market economic doctrine by favoring a centrally planned economy. It appeared unlikely to adopt a democratic electoral process, and finally refused to align with the US in its struggle against the Soviet Union. In fact, doing the opposite by cozying up to Moscow economically and politically and fostering anti-American sentiments. All of this while being on the US's doorstep. In the words of Livingston Merchant, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the Cuban problem is the most difficult and dangerous in the history of our relations with Latin America, possibly in all our foreign relations. It was in this geopolitical climate that the CIA embarked on a mission to decapitate the state that it now viewed as an existential threat. Castro would have to go. In a dingy room in Washington, D.C., sometime in August of 1960, 2 senior CIA officers met in an off-the-books meeting. Officially, the US government attitude to the embryonic Castro regime remained neutral, so they would have to figure out a way to get rid of Castro in a manner that would not implicate the United States. It was not long before one of them suggested an outrageous plot. Richard Bissell's idea, one that involved, in his own words, recruiting gangster-type forces to facilitate an assassination campaign against Fidel Castro, would go down in history as one of the most bizarre plots the CIA had ever engineered. However, in their eyes, it made perfect sense. US businesses controlled vast swathes of the nation's key industries, from telephone and electricity infrastructure to oil refining and lucrative sugar exports. American mafiosos and crime syndicates had also long operated lucrative bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rackets in Cuba. When Castro took over the country in January of 1959, most American businesses were expelled as the economy was nationalized. The crime syndicates that had set up shop there suffered the same fate. The loss of the island constituted a massive financial hit for them. At one point, it had been touted as the Las Vegas of Latin America due to how profitable Cuba had become for casinos and their owners, and they had just let that golden goose slip through their fingers. As a result of this setback, US mafia organizations with significant stakes in Cuba suddenly had a bone to pick with Fidel Castro. Of course, the CIA recognized that this animosity could be used to their advantage. Both parties had much to gain in removing Castro from power. The United States might gain another amenable government on its doorstep and reclaim its economic investments, and the Mafia could take back its gambling syndicates, restoring an arrangement that had worked perfectly well for decades. A bonus was that the CIA could obscure its involvement in the entire operation and chalk up any violence or the assassination of Castro himself to a turf war between the Cuban government and Mafia interests, thus keeping their hands, at least nominally, clean. To get the ball rolling on the Mafia plot, the CIA Director of Security, Sheffield Edwards, reached out to a former FBI agent, then lawyer Robert Mayhew, who was thought to have underworld contacts. As it happened, he was indeed able to provide access to an influential mobster by the name of Johnny Rosselli, a high-echelon enforcer working for the infamous Chicago outfit, the same organization once headed by Al Capone. Mayhew and Rosselli met on the 14th of September 1960 at the Plaza Hotel in New York. where he posed as a representative of, quote, several international business firms which were suffering heavy financial losses in Cuba as a result of Castro's actions, obscuring the CIA's involvement from the gangster. He explained to Rosselli that these firms were willing to pay around $150,000 for a successful hit on the Cuban leader. Of course, no such businesses existed. Every cent was coming straight from the CIA's coffers. Rosselli's instinct was to reject that offer and not get involved, but after some prodding, he was finally convinced, agreeing to introduce Mayhew to a man he knew to be part of the Cuban crowd, but not before insisting he do it for free. 11 days later, the two met up again at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami to speak with this mysterious individual, a man posing under the pseudonym of Sam Gold. Somewhere across the room stood another shadowy figure, a CIA agent who had been dispatched to secretly surveil the meeting. Mr. Gold's identity would not be uncovered until a few weeks later, when Mayhew recognized his face in a Miami newspaper clipping. Sam Gold was none other than the heir to the Al Capone empire, Salvatore Giancana. Giancana did end up joining the scheme that day, offering up a courier that could smuggle any necessary materiel into Cuba and establish sympathetic contacts there as well. That courier, known only to the CIA at the time as Joe, would be revealed as the notorious mobster Santo Trafficante, the Sicilian Mafia's Cuba boss. Trafficante's casino operations on the island had been severely restricted by Castro's revolutionary government, cratering profitability. In addition, Trafficante himself had been imprisoned and forced into informal exile after he tried to bribe a Cuban official in 1959. His gambling empire in Cuba had fallen as a direct result of Castro's rise to power, and it would therefore make sense to align against him. So the CIA had found their Mafia Connection, a group of criminally inclined individuals who shared a common enemy, and had the necessary connections to get close to Castro without revealing any US government involvement. It was, in the CIA's eyes, the perfect crime. While Mayhew, Rosselli, Giancana and Trafficante worked to acquire a contact in Cuba willing to carry out the assassination, the CIA had to develop the means through which to actually kill Castro. Initially, they considered a, quote, gangland-style killing in which Castro would be gunned down, presumably as it most visibly communicated a mafia-related attack, making it easier to distance themselves from it. However, the mobsters involved advised against such action. It would be nearly impossible to find anyone willing to conduct such a brazen hit, as the likelihood of being captured and killed was so high. Declassified documents also show that less than a month after the Miami meeting, the agency commissioned a box of Castro's favorite Cuban cigars to be laced with botulinum toxin, a nerve agent that gradually paralyzes the body's muscles in strong enough doses, leading to the failure of the respiratory system and ultimately death. While these were never used, the cigars were tested roughly 6 years later during an internal review of the operation, and they were found to be so potent that, quote, merely putting one in the mouth would do the job. Numerous other methods were discussed, but ultimately, the CIA elected to employ dissolvable pills that could be secretly placed in Castro's food or drink. These pills, like the previously considered cigars, would deliver a lethal dose of botulinum toxin once consumed. Now, all that was left was to find a willing individual with close enough access to Castro to slip the poison into his food surreptitiously. As it happened, the mafiosos in the CIA's employ had found just the person, a man working in the Cuban Prime Minister's office by the name of Juan Orta. He had been receiving bribes from Cuba's gambling syndicates before Castro's takeover, but now with the island's casinos closing rapidly, Orta was losing a lucrative gig and was on the brink of financial peril. Bringing him in on the operation gave him much-needed cash and allowed him to take revenge on Castro. After some trial and error, the CIA perfected its botulinum pills sometime in February of 1961 and subsequently began transferring them via its distribution chain to the gangster Santo Traficante. By March of the same year, the pills had arrived with Orta in Cuba, but to the confusion of the CIA, he returned them shortly afterwards. They theorized that he had gotten cold feet and abandoned the operation. However, unbeknownst to them at the time, Orta had recently lost his privileged position at the Prime Minister's office and by April 11th was seeking asylum at the Venezuelan embassy in Havana. Whether he was frozen out of the position and forced into exile for reasons unrelated or because Castro's security services had gotten wind of the plot is not known. Dejected but not defeated, the CIA renewed its efforts to poison Castro. They again relied on their mafia contacts. Via Santo Traficante, they reached out to a senior figure within the Cuban exile community, Antonio de Varona. Varona was the leader of the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front, or FRD, a quasi-paramilitary political organization dead set on the overthrow of the Castro regime. Traficante approached Varona under the same corporate ruse that had been initially used to recruit him. Hearing it, Varona jumped at the offer. He had become dissatisfied with the slow progress of the anti-Castro movement through conventional channels and was thrilled to have what he thought were wealthy business benefactors willing to fund his schemes against the Cuban government. This time, Varona was to deliver the botulinum pills to a waiter working in one of Castro's favorite restaurants, at which point it would be easy to slip them into his food unnoticed. But this scheme was interrupted by the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, which placed all other Cuba-related operations on standby. The Bay of Pigs invasion involved sending more than 1,000 FRD guerrillas trained by the CIA to land on the southern coast of Cuba, here at the Bay of Pigs. It failed miserably. The guerrillas were poorly organized, poorly informed, and lacked the support of the Cuban population, and most were either captured or executed. This bungled operation would become one in a long line of clandestine plots against Cuba to crash and burn. The CIA had already failed to get close to Castro once, but this seemed to seal their fate. Every successive attempt at infiltration into Cuba would be almost comically thwarted, either by bad luck, the ineptitude of intelligence assets, or poor planning on the CIA's part. Sometime after May of 1962, the attempt to poison Castro at his favorite restaurant fell through, reportedly because he, quote, ceased to visit that particular restaurant. The botulinum pills were subsequently returned and destroyed. Another failure. Thereafter, the CIA began implementing wilder schemes directed at the Castroite government, one of which involved renting out a U-Haul van, loading it full of rifles, handguns, surveillance equipment, and explosives, and handing it over to Antonio de Varona via mafia contacts. Varona would use this equipment to arm his own militiamen, and with CIA support, land in Cuba from the Florida Keys and recruit locals to assassinate Castro. This operation failed too. The militiamen never left their staging point in Florida, citing the, quote, adverse conditions inside Cuba as the reason for their inaction. However, my suspicion is that it was so poorly thought through that the men involved never initiated the operation for fear of ending up like their fallen Bay of Pigs comrades. In that vein, one CIA report stated that they appeared to have no specific plan for killing Castro, and just what they were supposed to do was pretty vague. While all of this was happening, one of the mobsters working for the CIA almost exposed the agency's plot against Castro to the public. Sometime between late 1961 and early 1962, Salvatore Giancana, initially consulted for contacts inside of Cuba, contacted Robert Mayhew and asked that he bug the room of his then mistress, Phyllis McGuire, while she was working in Las Vegas. Giancana suspected her of having an affair with the comedian Dan Rowan and wanted to gather evidence to that effect. Mayhew initially refused, but Giancana argued that Mayhew owed him after he had helped with the Castro assassination plot. Mayhew finally caved to the request, hiring a private investigator to place recording devices in Rowan's Las Vegas hotel room on Giancana's behalf. Naturally, as seems to be the case with every CIA-related scheme, this plan also failed miserably. Instead of bugging the room, the investigator tapped the phones, which would have limited recordings only to calls. The worst part, though, was that he left his wiretapping equipment out in the open because he was so keen to catch Dan Rowan's comedy show before it started. You couldn't make this up, even if you tried. The equipment was subsequently discovered by hotel staff, the police were informed, and the private investigator responsible was taken into custody. Fast forward a little bit, and suddenly both Mayhew and Giancana have been implicated in a federal crime under the wiretapping statute. And because a former FBI asset was concerned, that being Mayhew, the FBI itself also got involved, initiating prosecution against the group. To keep the Castro assassination plot and its connection with the Mafia a secret, Mayhew called on the CIA to cover his ass, which it did. It argued that this bugging scheme was part of intelligence gathering efforts with regards to Cuba, which we know to be untrue, and that any prosecution could threaten to unearth sensitive intelligence operations and assets and embarrass the government. In short, the CIA asked the FBI to cease their investigation, a request that was ultimately honored. But not before the US Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was informed of the saga. In a closed-doors meeting between Kennedy and CIA top brass, he stated, "I trust that if you ever try to do business with organized crime again, with gangsters, you will let the Attorney General know before you do it."